Welcome to the session on what scientists can learn from journalists and the media. This is a wonderful opportunity for turning the tables and for all of us to learn from these experts. So I'm thrilled that you're all here. And we have our first speaker, which is Virginia Gewin.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I am the first of this wonderful panel that has been assembled, and I'm really happy to see everyone here. So I'm going to just kind of set the stage with a bit about what it's like to work with a journalist. Really quickly, how many of you have worked with a journalist? Okay. Good experience, bad experience, mid? All right. So let's just set the stage with where journalism is at right now. And it's not great. I think, people are probably aware that newspapers are folding. There's tight budgets. It's really hard to get money to go out in the field. Widespread layoffs, meaning there are even more freelancers, which the bulk of science journalism, I would say, is done by freelancers anyway. And the trust in the news is low. And audience engagement is really moving towards TikTok, social media. And in the very near distance is AI looming. And so it is a very uncertain landscape right now for journalists. Really quickly, I just wanted to kind of talk about the two different ways you're most likely to interact with a journalist: news versus features. So a news story, you've got this great new publication that's going to come out in Nature or Science, and your organization has done a press release, and there's a big blitz around it, and it's going to be usually a lot of journalists trying to get in touch with you in a very short time frame. It's going to be very frenetic, frantic, and you're not going to get that much time with the journalist, versus a feature, whereas something that typically takes longer. I've been working on features that can take, a few weeks to almost a year. And I think every journalist in here has had those experiences where it can be a long haul. You can have a lot of time with the journalist. You can sometimes go out in the field if you're lucky. And it's a longer process, a more in-depth process to give a really strong narrative to something that you hope is going to have a big impact when it comes out. So what to know about working with the journalist? For a longer feature, we need a narrative, not a topic. We need a story. We're going to have to talk about some backstory, some cool science. How did this all come together? What's the cool thing in the field that happened? I want to be in the field when it's happening. Those kinds of things. You, the scientist, will be the main character. That is not a comfortable place for a lot of people, but you got to get used to it, because you're the action. You're the person doing the action in the story. If you can, invite a journalist into the field. If you're doing like a cool big campaign, or you're going into backpack in somewhere fun, like I'm always game for that. Invite a journalist to go to work with you. Even if it will be months before your paper comes out, you can negotiate that timeline with the journalist. So when the LA fires broke out last year, I was on a plane the next day and went and met a postdoc that I knew was going around and collecting smoke samples from every fire in the West. And I was going to be there, hell or high water, to get that color for the eventual story, which has yet to come out. His paper is just now going into review, and I'm still waiting to pitch that story. But I had the bandwidth, I had a fellowship, I was able to do that reporting just to get those details for whenever this story is eventually going to come out. That is not that common, but it can happen. The last thing is that journalists will fact check with you. They will not give you the whole story to read over and go through. That's where, like, any good journalist is going to call you back, fact check everything, make sure it's accurate. Everybody wants an accurate story. Nobody wants to have to do a correction, but you're not going to be able to look at the whole thing. So the other thing I have to do is I have to convince an editor that this is a story that's worth time, energy, effort. Why will readers care? What's at stake? Is there an interesting backstory or recent discovery? Are cool maps involved? A cool map can go a long way, and that's what I'm banking on for tempo. And are there any striking data that tell the story like really dramatically? So I wanted to walk through just a few examples of recent stories that I've done in the last like 3 to 5 years. Air quality can be a tough sell, especially if you're going to get into the weeds with the science. So this is a story I did for Scientific American, I don't know, like 3 years ago. And it was a little hard to sell this one because we were looking at, I wanted to tell the story of how primary pollutants have, for large part, kind of gotten under control. But now there's just a lot of emphasis on secondary pollution and the reactivity in atmospheric chemistry, and how we really need to start looking at like what's going on, and how we call it PM 2.5, but it's not the same everywhere. And so I think that's a big misconception. It's just like there's a lot of unique differences in what we call PM 2.5. And so I wanted to try to start chipping away at that in the story. When I sent the pitch, the editor was like, well, I think maybe let's like figure out, like, is this more, I had been to the American Association for Aerosol Research. Did I get that right? So it was in Portland, which is where I'm based. I'm a freelancer. And I had seen, can't remember her name, but a woman give a talk about this big campaign that they had done in New York City. And so it was like 4 weeks. And they were trying to really understand the dynamics over summertime and try to understand like what was happening with secondary pollution. And so the editor was interested, but there were some concerns. Like, what does this mean beyond New York City? Is it relevant to the nation? Are there things that we can say specifically about the pollutants that you want to highlight? Like, what are the health implications? Like, there was a lot of back and forth to really get this to be something that would go forward. So it takes a lot of back and forth, and you may have to have some back and forth with a journalist just to kind of really dial in, like, what is the story that we can tell, that we're on solid footing about, and like feel confident going forward. After the 2020 wildfires in the Pacific Northwest, I was a changed person. 2 weeks in your house with AQI off the charts, red skies will do that to you. But it's what really led me to where I am now. This is 6 years later. I'm still focused on air quality, public health, all of these things. So this is a story I did for Nature that was kind of like the follow-on of all of that. It was really just trying to understand. I started looking at the EPA data. I started looking at the AQI monitor data. I started looking at what was actually happening with air quality. And for the first time, the EPA data was really starting to show that, fires were having this marked impact on air quality. And for the first time, pollutant levels were going up. And so that was enough. I needed the data in hand to convince my editor, who was in DC and in London, that this was an issue, that he wasn't seeing it, but this was a problem. And so I convinced him. The EPA data was enough for me to convince him. We had a graphic, we had a map, boom, boom, we're done, we're good. 6 months later, Canada blows up in wildfires, and I get an email from him in DC saying, I'm so glad we did that story. I had no idea that he was sitting in AQI off the charts, so he got it. So the other way to go at this is environmental justice framing. I mean, I think this is a story that I did for GRIST that was looking at EPA had, under the Biden administration, all of this money to give air quality monitors to environmental justice communities. And they were so excited. A lot of them were using them. They were trying to use that data to lobby for different policy changes, things like that. Then states started to try to pass, or did pass, laws that you could not use community-based air monitors in any kind of regulatory or legal affairs. And that was like, well, then what was the point? And I think this is the kind of story that you need to tell for accountability. So there's accountability stories where you say, where did all that money go and why did we pursue that strategy when there was no intention in some states to ever use it in the first place. And unfortunately, fires have been the catalyst for a lot of the interest in air quality right now. I think that, a lot of people are even lobbying for us to not call them wildfires anymore, call them urban fires, because now we're getting to the point where it's not trees that are just going up anymore. As everyone in this room is well aware, it's plastics, it's car batteries, it's all kinds of things. And we don't really know what is on all of that smoke. So that's why I've been following the guy that's going to every fire in the West and collecting air samples so that he can look at the particulates and like really do some due diligence on like what is in each of those size fractions. So, you know, I am here because I have a huge interest in this. I love to geek out and understand what you all are working on. I want to have conversations. I want to know what you're working on. You know, this whole notion that we treat PM 2.5 as a monolith is something that I really am personally motivated to dispel. So I have lots of ideas about how I can tackle this with stories. So if anyone is interested, I would love to chat further. And I really want to do stories that can kind of advance and showcase like how tempo can alter this air quality conversation. I think there's a lot of different ways that we can collaborate to kind of do some really interesting work and highlight what is being done. So for example, I don't know if she's in here. Yes, we already have a conversation about, you know, what does a national picture of VOCs look like? I really want to like start to understand like how we can do stories that will highlight that as well. And that's the end of my talk.
Thank you. Oh, great. We have Rebecca Ramirez. Rachel Ramirez. Sorry. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. A lot of what I'm going to say is probably a little bit repetitive of what Virginia said, but I want to ask this very specific question, another version of what she said earlier, which is how many of you have pitched a story directly to a journalist without your comms people? Show of hands. Okay, 2. Wow. Okay. So if you haven't, and if you want to foster a working source reporter relationship with a journalist, I'm going to be talking about the art of pitching, how to overall engage with a journalist, and also just like humanizing the science, the data behind your work. I guess first a little bit about me. I am a freelancer now. I've been a journalist for a decade, but I did have a long journey. I started off as a business reporter. I worked at the Financial Times. It was my first big girl job. It was where I learned a lot about the energy markets, the influence of the oil and gas industry. And then in 2019, I sort of pivoted as a climate environment reporter, starting off at GRIS, which you saw Virginia showed earlier. And I now run a newsletter called The Confluence. It's theconfluence.news right here. It's supported by the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus, where I tell ocean stories that connect science and social justice. And before that, for 5 years, I was a climate reporter at CNN. I'm now based in New York City, but I was born and raised in the Northern Mariana Islands, which is a U.S. territory just north of Guam. All right. So I guess I want to preface this, and I have a cheat sheet because I tend to ramble, and I know that I'm being timed. I want to preface this by saying that data and your work, science, is incredibly important, and without it, our stories as journalists wouldn't have that sort of significant foundation, right? But pitching a scientific research to a journalist, as Virginia said, is more about the narrative arc. As journalists, we look for stories that resonate with our audience, and the scientists and experts I love to talk to are those that can really translate complex findings and data into real world stakes, right? Scientists are trained to lead with the data and end with conclusion and the findings. But for journalists, we want to lead with that conclusion, with your findings, and then use the data as evidence. If it bleeds, it leads, right? So here we see a graph that shows the trend of sea level rise, and on the left, and on the right, we see a photo. I guess I'm sure you probably know where I'm going with this, but with the graph, well, it is incredibly important. Our readers and audience will sort of perceive this as something distant. You know, it requires that kind of cognitive labor to translate what 0.1 meters is into a lived reality. But meanwhile, the photo on the right, the audience sees a sort of disruption. You see a man kayaking past this coffee shop where they probably normally would buy a latte, and it turns this consequence into an experience. It kind of like provokes that emotion. The graph on the left tells us the world is changing. The photo on the right tells us why it matters. And if we only give our audience the graph, you're sort of asking them to do the work that we do as a journalist to interpret what this graph means. But if we give the photo first, we are giving them a reason to read your paper and read our article. So coming to a journalist with this in mind really helps kind of frame how you talk to them. Okay, now I want to show you an example that I wrote just based on staring at the US drought monitor one day. Here, as you can see, I have the drought monitor from NOAA, and this isn't current. This was released on March 2023. And the drought monitor, as probably most of you know, gets updated weekly on Thursdays. This one came after much needed storms alleviated much of the historic multi-year drought that really happened across the West Coast. And, the Colorado River was a big story then, which Joan might probably talk about. She covered a lot about that. The Pacific Northwest heat wave and a lot of the record-breaking wildfires. But when you look at this map, much of the attention will probably be in this patch of red land in the Great Plains that's experiencing extreme to exceptional drought. But if you zoom in closer out west, you can see there's one speck of exceptional drought right in Oregon, in Central Oregon. I was wondering what's going on there, I thought. And so I published a story. The massive amounts of snow and rain turns out largely missed this part of Oregon. And being that I am familiar in Oregon, I lived in Oregon for a while, I'm actually getting married in Oregon. I contacted some of my friends and some of my old sources from working in Oregon to see which farmers, ranchers, people who lived in this very dry state part of the area I could talk to and kind of hear their stories. And then this story was published. First generation farmers and ranchers told me that they started noticing for sale signs pop up in farmland, and how they've had to change their ways in terms of with farming and just overall like dealing with water shortages. But really what I'm trying to say, humanize the map, the original NOAA map of that came from the drought monitor in the last slide. Okay, here you're going to see a little bit of repeat from Virginia's presentation, but when I get pitches from scientists or communication managers or really any PR emails, I always ask, so what? And these are sort of the three things that I really look for. First is the human element. How can I tell the story in a way that would resonate with people? I know they should care about it, but how can I grab their attention? And it doesn't have to be sort of very human-centered either. I could try to grab a reader's attention by telling them to imagine a long river of water vapor in the sky when I'm writing about atmospheric rivers, right? Other things I'd ask you as a scientist is probably if you have a personal connection to your work, was there something strange or funny or that you'd like to share while you're doing your research? Reporters love these details and it makes the story more interesting to write and read. Oh, the second one is the local connection. A lot of you might probably be pitching to the Chicago Tribune or the Wisconsin State Journal or the Arizona Republic. So why should these local readers care? How could I make it hit home for them? And then lastly is, and this is the most important part that many newsroom editors look for, is the newsiness. This is something that scientists and researchers often forget. Why should I tell this story now? It's not because you, the scientist or the lead author, have been working on it for years and then you're just now publishing it. But sometimes if it is really groundbreaking, that could be the news hook. But how does it apply to recent policy change? How does it apply to the war in Iran, something going on locally? So what this means is that not every single research study or new finding will be of interest to journalists. Study sites often seek get approved, tend to be research findings that are new or not previously known. And Virginia said, something that represents a significant advancement in a field, or something weird or visually unusual. Like one time I wrote a story about a purple smoke coming out of a waste incinerator smokestack. And then the next is really think about what is the story, right? One thing that many scientists I meet don't know is that I, as a reporter and writer, I'm not the decision maker. It's my editor who decides, as Virginia said. So you might be pitching me, but oftentimes I have to rework your pitch to make sure that my editor sees the value of the story so they know why I should be working on this. And also we get a lot of emails as journalists. So be concise, make sure it's scannable, make sure the first 2 sentences contain the most surprising element, make sure it's bullet pointed, analogies are gold. And I'm gonna have to ask you for case studies as well, and any examples from the community to really humanize that story. This is just the IPCC report and making sure it's just showing you how we sort of humanize the story. We used a lot of visuals because this was a very, very science-heavy international report. And then I'll just leave you with this. This is from Alberto Cairo. Data doesn't speak for itself. We are the ones to give it a soul and a voice.
Thank you. That was terrific. Next, we have Joan Miners. You and this is try.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, is that working? Okay. All right, thanks. I picked a slide template with a lake because you guys have lakes. I live in Arizona. I don't have lakes, but you guys do. But this is the prettiest slide. I kind of skimped on the aesthetics, so I apologize for that. My name is Joan Miners. I'm currently the climate reporter at the Arizona Republic, but prior to getting interested in journalism, I completed a PhD in ecology. And so just to say that in the course of making the transition from science research into science journalism, I had a lot of thoughts about how we can work better together toward the goal of improving the information that's available to the public about science. So I was pleased to get the invite for this panel and be able to share some of that with you. So this is I'm glad Virginia and Rachel covered this. This is a little repetitive, so we all have a problem with misinformation. I think it stresses everyone out in this room probably how prevalent it is. It's everywhere. Real journalism is declining. There are fewer of us trying to cover a more complex world with less funding. We're also losing access to scientists through federal gag orders. And all of that means that you guys are spread more thin. And I have many friends in science. I know many people who are very wary of talking to the media. People always do that, like the media, like it's a thing. That's not really a thing. So there's a lot of fear, right, that your science is going to be misrepresented. So I'm going to kind of give you an idea of how to deal with that. So yeah, we all recognize that disinformation, being the more malicious form of misinformation, is eroding trust in both science and media. And we know that has consequences for public health with vaccine hesitancy, loss of funding for basic research if we're not helping people understand why that matters. And to combat the disinformation from like the fossil fuel or the tobacco industry, journalists can help fact check. We can publish accountability journalism to the extent that we have the bandwidth for that. What we can do together better is work on combating misinformation. And unintentional miscommunications usually happen, I would say, for one of 3 reasons. The scientist isn't completely clear, the journalist misinterprets what you say, and or something else happens in the reader's brain. We really can't do much about that last one other than overhauling the entire education system, which we should totally do, but not right now. So we'll talk about the first 2. The scientist isn't clear, not not blaming you guys, but you're trained to think in a very specific way. I know this because I had to like reformat my brain when I became a journalist. This is usually dealt with by offering media or communications training for scientists. There's a lot of options, from in-person workshops to like online courses that you can work through. You can take a class on campus usually. And this is a description of why that matters that I agree with. Media training is to prepare scientists to speak to the public in a clear, concise, engaging way, convey the significance of their research, make it relatable and relevant to the public. Those are great things. When I was a PhD student, I actually attended one of these media training workshops, and I was quite alarmed this was before I was even had journalism on my brain. I was quite alarmed to be instructed that I have to be very careful what I say to journalists because it could be misused to like further their reporting agenda. I was told to stick to the basics so the journalists can understand, to avoid nuance and complexity because that will just cause confusion. And I was just a student, so I was like not talking to anybody, but this was a little scary. A lot of times these media training courses for scientists pretty much boil down to avoid jargon. Like that's kind of like the thing that you take home and remember. And this is an excerpt from a popular book on training scientists to be better communicators. And it essentially just says, you know, your readers don't know words like tritrophic, ecological assemblage, genomics, parthenogenesis. That's not because your reader is dumb. It's because scientists made up those words and never told anyone but other scientists. Totally true. But I kind of hate that we focus so much on this advice because I think that like just avoiding jargon by itself is actually really boring and doesn't really solve that many problems. First point is that, thank you. First point is that all words are made up. They're all made up until we tell a bunch of people what they mean and we all start using them and then we don't think they're made up anymore. So let's like tell people what words mean and teach them a new word. Readers that are gonna read a story about science anyway are gonna be the same people that would like to learn 1 or 2 new words. So don't put 20 new words in a story, but you can teach journalists a word and they can teach it to their readers, and that's science communication. Obviously, moderation is required. Like I said, you don't want to throw 20 new words in a story. That will alienate your readers. But it's okay to write for different levels and to have different goals with different stories, right? So the point that I've built up to here is that not all readers are the same and not all writers are the same. And the solution is to know who you're talking to. And for us, that's knowing who we're writing for, who our audience is. For you, that's knowing who your journalist is. Which brings us to the problem of journalists misinterpreting what you're telling them about your science. The argument I'm making here is that there is definitely such a thing as inexperienced, lazy, or rushed journalists that make mistakes. There's also probably a thing where it's true that some journalists could have malicious intent or just be trying to go for a clickbait story because they have to write 10 stories a week and they don't have time. But I hope that you've taken away from the first 2 presentations that there's a lot of science journalists who actually know and care a lot about science. And I think you spending 10 minutes learning the difference when you get an email from a journalist asking to interview you can actually really improve the outcome. And it's way better than just gatekeeping science and dumbing everything down. So before I interview a scientist, I am going to look at their institution or personal webpage. I'm going to look at their Google Scholar page. I'm going to skim a couple of their papers or maybe read it in depth if the interview is specifically about that. I'm going to Google them to make sure nothing weird comes up. Do they have an online presence? Have they shared any fringe opinions? Have they been quoted saying something controversial? Are there any allegations against them? These aren't things that would necessarily cause me to cancel the interview, but they are definitely, it's definitely context that I want to know before I talk to you and quote you in a story, right? I'm going to recommend that before you are interviewed as a scientist, you do the same. Look at the journalist's staff or personal page. Have they been writing for Scientific American and probably know what they're talking about? Or do they write for some weird climate denial blog? You want to know the difference. Look at their background. Let's check their LinkedIn page real quick. Skim a couple of their stories. Are they in depth or are they 4 paragraphs long? And Google them. Make sure nothing weird comes up. How do they frame their stories? Do you detect a bias? Do they seem balanced? I know you're busy. We are too. But I would say that doing this quick search on your end can help you manage this fear about saying the wrong thing to the wrong journalist and having it end up in print, and then you just have to live with that being on the internet. It can help you prepare for the interview and reduce your stress. It will facilitate better journalism, and it also allows you to enjoy the process of sharing your science. You guys spend all your time becoming experts on very specific things. It's cool when someone wants to ask you about it, right? This may not seem like a huge deal, but in interviews, I have had scientists not know what outlet I'm writing for. Spend time on explaining spend half the interview explaining a concept that I didn't ask about and don't need explained, and then we can't get to other things. And when I ask about methods or statistical details or something where it's just helping me understand better what you did, that I'm not necessarily going to put that in the story, but it's so that I understand and can translate it better, they'll brush it off and be like, oh, that's too complicated to get into. These are all missed opportunities for better knowledge exchange. Which brings us back to not all readers are the same, not all writers are the same. Knowing who you're talking to leads to better science journalism, lower scientist stress, improved public information, and restoring trust in science and journalism as a whole. I'm sorry my slides are so ugly, but the take-home message is know your journalist as just one tip for improving the interview experience and the outcome. It's our job to know how much detail we can give our audience. It's your job to know how much detail you can give your journalist. And all of this will protect you, facilitate better journalism, and open up opportunities for more nuanced coverage, like Virginia's talking about. She wants to get into the details about particulate matter and all this stuff. Not every journalist does, but when she emails you and you Google her and now you know that, now you know you can go there with her. So that's the end of my little spiel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. And last we have Rebecca Theim.
I'm Rebecca Theim. I'm the communications manager with the Pew Charitable Trust. Curious how many of you all have the benefit, or some of you may think the burden of working with a communications person in your NASA shop. Okay, it's good. That's good to know. You're probably more familiar with the Pew Research Center, which is our fabulous sister organizations, which does all those great surveys that you see quoted in the news media about all kinds of things in American life, and that you may have even cited in some of your own research at times. I'm on the other side of the house. I'm with my colleague Sylvia Truce, who's over here in the white and the black. She'll be speaking at the Outrider meeting tomorrow, so check her out too. We are on the trust side, which broadly works in 2 portfolio arenas. We look at research very deeply. We are deeply nonpartisan. We go where the research takes us in making our policy recommendations. Our 2 broad portfolios are environment, which is one of the reasons why we're here. And then we also have a smaller part that's focusing on improving U.S. government performance. So I said bipartisan, nonpartisan. We are passionately nonpartisan. We go where the data takes us. So we are very dependent on the kind of data that people like you provide out in the public sphere. And I work for a specific project called the U.S. Environmental Conservation Project. And Sylvia runs one of the larger campaigns there on nature-based solutions. So basically protecting and expanding habitats that sequester carbon and help with our issues with climate change. including peatlands here in Wisconsin, where we're getting some work off the ground, and Sylvia and her team have some fabulous work underway on that. And before that, I spent a decade as a daily newspaper reporter. I was in New Orleans and Fort Lauderdale, so I have a little bit in common with my brethren up here. And I tap that work every day in my work with Pew. So what I'm responsible for doing is taking all this fabulous, sometimes wonky science that we get from ourselves, from others, certainly from you, from partners, and presenting that in a way that non-scientific people can understand, along with our policy recommendations. So some of you may recognize this. I grabbed this off the NASA website. It's a data visualization showing how carbon dioxide moves across the planet over time. So the Pew Research Center, our sister organization, found in 2024 that 89% of Americans trust scientists, but only 45% of them think that scientists communicate well. So when you're communicating to a non-scientific audience, not meeting your audience where it is at that time is how your good data can die. Not from inaccuracy, but from irrelevance. You got to make it relevant to those people's lives. So today I'm going to try to hit 3 simple, not necessarily easy, but simple lessons that I hope can make your data resonate more without losing precision or rigor. Lesson number 1 is to make data matter to people. How do we communicate complex information so that it resonates with ordinary people? How can we demonstrate that data's thoughtful application can improve someone's life? This is a photo of Utah's Ether Hollow in September 2020. This family home was burning. It was supposedly in no danger, believe it or not, that fire behind them. And they were sitting out on their lawn watching the mountain burn, as the photographer told me last week. But even though they were told their home was in no danger, I have to think and wonder that they were wondering what the future holds, which sets up my lesson 2. Data is abstract, but impact is real. So start with what people recognize, a risk, safety, disruption, or a benefit, and your data will have somewhere to land when it's out there in the real world. When you start with a pain point or an aspirational one, you can use data to confirm it, and then you can use data to show how it can get better. So if you have a problem, you have data, the solution. If you lead with your data, you risk losing the audience. If you lead with a problem or desire people have, your data has valuable work to do. This photo illustrates one of Pew's most recent successful campaigns. It's an image of a bull moose that was killed after being hit by a large truck in Quebec, Canada. The Associated Pew campaign advocates for public funding to construct wildlife crossing in targeted states. And this work, as you'll see in a second, demonstrates many pain points. So Pew started on this issue with understanding from data that climate change is altering animal migration patterns. That plus increasing development and traffic meant more and more dangerously and deadly large wildlife vehicle collisions. Data tells us that if a car had hit this bull moose and not a large truck, in all likelihood, its passengers would have been killed or at very least would have been critically injured. So Pew dug into the data and found out that tens of thousands of injuries, hundreds of deaths, millions of accidents, and billions in cost, not to mention the loss of wildlife, were happening every year because of this issue. So in addition to data quantifying the problem, Pew mined that data to highlight a solution. For example, a single crossing, like the one that's in the inset on this slide, can prevent 1,400 crashes and save 1,200 animals over a 70-year lifespan of one of these crossings, a single crossing. So data both defined that problem and offered a solution. And ideally, you need a who, to speaking to some of the points that the journalist up here said, making it resonate with your audience, a credible spokesperson. After a family tragedy, Mary Rodriguez humanized this issue first before the Colorado legislature and then this video. I'm just going to show the first minute of it.
Wildlife have migration patterns, and they move from place to place like they always have. With as much as Colorado has developed in recent years and the amount of people who are moving to our state, these roads are becoming more heavily traveled. And because of that, the risk of running into wildlife drastically increases. My father was coming home from a weekend away in the mountains with family, and an oncoming motorist hit an elk. They didn't see it. It was standing in the road at night and projected it onto the oncoming traffic. There was no way for him to see it coming, and it just came crashing through his windshield. The elk stopped the car dead in its tracks. It dawned on me when my father was killed that there was no wildlife fencing or protection for animals and for humans in that stretch of highway.
Okay. The results of all this work that Pew and a bunch of coalition members across many states was that we had dozens of news media reports, and policymakers in these states responded. Only since March, Utah, Virginia, and Colorado have allocated millions of dollars toward the construction of these types of wildlife crossings and for connectivity resources. I wish I could say that it works out that way all the time in our work. It doesn't, but this was one of those sweet spots. And two of my colleagues, Amal Lamar and Emily Diamond Falk, have led a lot of this work with their policy people. So you had pain, a compelling spokesperson, and public attention leading to legislative action. So one final important consideration: what scale resonates with the audience? Is it a state issue? Is it a regional issue? Maybe it's a seasonal issue that only comes around once a year. And what frame? Is it safety? Is it cost? Those are two issues clearly under consideration in the wildlife crossings. Is it jobs and economy, which we're seeing a lot more of? Is it cultural, which we're seeing with some of the work we're undertaking with Indigenous people? Pew's work is increasingly looking at economic and policy safety frames to build that bipartisan support or nonpartisan support that I talked about earlier. The work I do with Sylvia's team focuses a lot, as I said, on nature-based solutions, on preserving all kinds of coastal wetlands, seagrass, and peatlands here in Wisconsin. And we use a variety of federal data and tools like the EP carbon equivalency calculator that tells us that, for example, the country's coterminous wetlands store as much carbon as is emitted by the coal the entire United States consumes over 56 years in today's consumption levels. So that's a lot of carbon pollution. And NOAA projections tell us that those same wetlands provide $28 billion in storm protection each year. So even if you're a climate change skeptic, you live in Pennsylvania and you're concerned about your children breathing air from coal-powered power plants, or you live in Charleston, South Carolina, which now floods an average of 1 day a week, those numbers speak to personal risk and disruptions you face almost every day. Oops. So if people don't see themselves in your data will struggle to mean much to move the needle. So that's the mission. Give your data a place to land in people's hearts and minds so that your work can do all the good that you want it to do.
Thank you for that. And so that's been really wonderful to have all this insight and guidance from our journalists and media and or members of the media. I guess a question I'd like to begin with and then foster more questions from all of you is, as scientists, we often feel compelled to convey a good news story. We write a proposal about how we're going to employ some new technical ability or how we're going to bring together this new data set and achieve this outcome, achieve this new piece of information. And I'll contrast that with some of the phrasing we've heard. If it bleeds, it leads, or if we're looking at acute effects of air pollution upon health. Is there a way that we could explore that space to convey some of those good news stories in a way that's more compelling to the public? Or is that just a really difficult space in order to engage in, where there's less public uptake in something that is a good news story versus something that is more calamitous? I'll pass it over.
We actually have.
Oh, sure. Thank you for that. And then this can be for the, yes.
I'll just start off really quick. I think there is a huge appetite for solutions journalism now. I think everyone is like in dire need of something to grab onto that is positive, and there is a big push for that in journalism at outlets. I think there's just a lot of fatigue around a lot of things that are downers, and we all need to have something to hold on to. So I think that's what I'm seeing is like more of a push. I mean, we're never going to get away from if it bleeds, it leads. Like there's just like, there's something compelling. It's like watching a car wreck. Like there's just something to that, like that people can't look away from. But I think more and more we are all challenged to find the solution stories.
Yeah, and just build on that and say that 100% agree about solutions. Some of my best stories at CNN were like disaster, destruction stories, but also like the new tech that's like being launched in the middle of nowhere in Massachusetts that will transition away fossil fuel usage, or like advancement in nuclear fusion as a renewable energy source. Those stories do really well. It just depends on how you frame it. And I just also remember back in GRIS, like when I was working at GRIS, one of my babies was the Beacon newsletter. I don't know how many of you heard of the Beacon newsletter, but the way it was structured was it's one big chunk, like 3 paragraphs of good news, and then we have the smog, which is like 3 different like bad news. But like the big news is like really the opening, and people really love that. And we had like hundreds of maybe more than like thousands of subscribers. I can't remember, but there is an appetite for solution stories mostly as good news.
I agree with what Virginia and Rachel said. I think we want to write good stories, but like that are not depressing. I know my mental health is affected by writing bad stories all the time. I don't want to be in that mental space either. And I also know that readers are tuning out because there's just so much bad. And then if readers are not reading, then what am I doing, right? So I think we want to write those stories. I think like my perspective so my job is to cover climate related news that is affecting Arizona, right? Which is like a lot of things. And I constantly have to triage what is most important to get into the publication record and to have online, not necessarily for immediate consumption, but so that it exists in the first draft of history. I'm having to like juggle and weigh like, what do I have time for? What is the most important information that people need to know? And how can I balance that with what's going to help us all not want to jump off a cliff? So that's the calculus that we're doing. It's not that we don't want to write news for you all. Oh, the other part of that, in my view, is that, a lot of solutions now are tech, they're companies. And those companies, and as well as like government agencies, they have PR people that are writing those stories, that are getting that information out there. The stuff where the information about, the harms of environmental repeal of a law, like the repeal of environmental law, or the holding a polluter accountable, that stuff doesn't exist unless we put it online usually. So like that's also how I view the way that we have to balance all this stuff. So we're not just writing depressing stuff because we are love disaster porn or something, like maybe some people do, but I personally love the solution stories. It's just hard to sometimes justify setting aside the time for that.
I'll just say when I'm not communicating for PO, I'm an adjunct instructor at the University of Maryland in the communication department. And there's scads of scholarly research and communications that show that while some of the earlier points, you look at the car wreck, people want good news stories. They want to have something aspirational. They want to have something that will inspire them. So I think there's plenty of room in this space to tell those stories, particularly when it's backed by great data like what NASA produces.
Great. Sure, I see. Is that because there's something online?
That's for me.
For you? Okay, good. I wasn't going to go online just yet. Good.
Sorry to confuse. Thank you all very much. It's so interesting. Like the common theme across all of you is how do you make data matter? And like, how do you appeal to that emotional response? And I think there are some topics, you know, such as climate change that seem like for certain groups of people, it's an unbreakable wall. Like it's hard to communicate certain things. So I guess my first part of my question is, do you feel like there's a way to break through that wall to get to people that otherwise are kind of have a very set mindset? And if so, like what are some of the methods that you find are helpful for doing that?
I guess like the first story or topic that comes to mind is like how, and it's something that I've been talking to a lot of fellow climate journalists about and other climate communicators, is how do we write about extreme heat without sounding like a broken record? Because like every year now, like 2024, 2025, and probably 2026 will be the hottest year on record. And so like, how do we get our audience to care? And I mean, I keep thinking of different ways to tell the story, like calling extreme heat a silent killer, or other analogies. As I said, analogies are gold, but it still does not hit home to a lot of our audience. Like the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold is still just a number to a lot of them. And so like, how do we explain that? And I guess like for me, the way I've seen it play out is like through visuals, like really heavy visuals. I know a lot of local news outlets, well, not Arizona Public, but there are some local news outlets that really like would post extreme heat stories that that show photos of people having fun in the beach, which does not really communicate the danger of extreme heat. And that's because it's low budget local newsrooms. They don't have a lot of photographers there. But one of the more powerful like visuals that I'm thinking about is actually in Arizona when they had to put like this man who had a heat stroke in a literal like body bag of ice. So that was like a very visual story that kind of puts that extreme heat story across. So yeah, I think for me, it would just be relying a lot on visuals is what I do. And I mean, CNN was my previous job. And so like CNN is a very visual heavy network. And so, and it's also a different audience from like local news outlets and other like Scientific American.
You're going.
I'm glad you asked it. So I think the advice a lot of the time is like, if it leads, it leads. If you need the human focus. I think I approach journalism like a scientist, and I'm looking for like if there's some story that's really big breaking news, but like everyone's writing about it, I'm not really interested in that. I'm looking for the thing that hasn't been done yet and that can fill a gap in the knowledge space and a different way to do stuff. And sometimes because of my interest and because of that focus, I'm actually pivoting more towards getting away from the human narrative. And I personally get burnt out on like stories that feel like anecdotes but don't prove to me that there's a real pattern happening. So I tend to want to write the stories that are a little more data focused. And so an example of that is that when I moved to Arizona in 2022, I just was immediately struck by how many homeless people there were and how difficult it was to see them outside in the heat all the time. And so I launched a big project where I was looking at the kind of intersection of the climate crisis in terms of extreme heat and the housing crisis in terms of having so many people exposed to that. And with a intern, we read the building codes of 40 different cities across Arizona and scored them based on their sustainability, emissions and sustainability metrics and things that they were considering. And then we looked at how much housing was actually being built in those places as a way to kind of score which municipalities in Arizona are actually solving this problem and thinking about this problem, and which of them are maybe greenwashing it, and which of them are maybe building. They have good policies, but they're not building, or maybe they're building a lot, but in a way that's just going to those homes are not good for the heat. They're not. So I think I'm just trying to say that one of the things that bothers me the most about the decline of journalism is that journalism is no longer this beat your colleague to the story kind of space. It's we're piecing together, we're trying to work as a collective unit to piece together the picture, and we're still having a lot of missing pieces. And so, yeah, I think having different approaches can be good.
Sure. Jenny, did you have a question?
Okay, great. I'm loving the panel. This is phenomenal. So one, I guess I have two questions. Maybe the simpler one is, I know journalists don't often have a lot of control over their headline. How much control do you have over the images that get included with your stories? And then second question is, we put on a lot of these meetings where we have a big audience, it's public, there could be a lot of people there that you're talking to, and so you get a lot of advice about know your journalist, which works when you're sitting down one-on-one with someone. How would you apply that towards a bigger audience? And maybe I wish I had asked this earlier before the meeting started. But how would you apply that towards a bigger audience to try to not be misunderstood, especially when you don't know who's listening or what they're going to do with that information?
Well, I'll take the first part of that. We have zero control over headlines or photos. That is a different. Well, and most of the I work for a lot of national outlets, and that's there is a separate photo editor who I never talk to. No. And they get all of the pictures. They write the captions. I might get a chance to see the caption and see if I can catch anything that's wrong. And I oftentimes will try and come up with a headline and offer it. Maybe I have a 25% hit rate where they like it and go with it. Most of the time they change it and they don't like it at all. So I think that's it's very compartmentalized in terms of what I turn in the copy of the body, and I work with an editor and fact checkers and multiple editors at most outlets. Beyond that, sometimes when I see it come out is the first time I've seen the whole thing all put together. Is that different for things?
No, it's absolutely the same. I guess for headlines, I will say I have different experiences. At CNN, I definitely don't have control over the headline, but then I can suggest a working headline, which my editor will build off of. There's also what we call the SEO headline, which is what the keyword filled with the keywords that people would search on Google so that it will pop up first, which is different than what you see in the homepage or the article. And for photos, I guess for me, I try to source as many community, if I'm writing about a community, my latest story about super typhoon Sinlaku that hit my hometown in the Northern Mariana Islands. I sourced a lot of the photos from friends and family, and then I submitted it, and they used it as a visual from the cover photo to everything, and with proper credit. I'm also going to have you repeat the second question because I think I was so focused on the headline part. But that photo I have some control, but it does have to go through photo editors and photo desks. Headline, not so much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so the second question is, like this is more with Joan's talk that anybody could say, you get this advice of know your journalist who you're talking to, if you can trust them, who your audience is, who they're gonna share this with. When you're talking with a broader group, that you're at an HAQAST meeting, for example, what are the strategies to communicate your science in a way that a journalist in the audience isn't gonna misinterpret that?
Are you talking about, so this scenario is, this is a meeting that where there are journalists present or it's recorded online, it's like on record, but you're talking in the moment to other scientists? That's the scenario?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, has that happened where you've been quoted from saying something in a meeting that you feel taken out of context?
Not me, but I mean, I've seen other people take from our meetings and use it as posts and articles and stuff like that.
Yeah, I guess these guys can weigh in. I guess I feel like it's not incredibly legitimate to just grab a quote from a recorded meeting or a place where you were not actually there without talking to the scientists and put it in a story. So, there's not a whole lot you can do about like bad faith journalists or people who are going to cut corners like that. But I think those things tend to come through in the story anyway. Like you read it and you're like, the person I think you can't spend your life worrying about what you're saying to your colleagues because it might be taken out of context by someone who's not even there. I think most good journalists aren't gonna do that. But I think you could also, if you're worried about it or if there's something about the setting that makes you concerned about that, you could say, this talk is off the record, don't quote me unless you contact me. And it's not like a legal document or something, but like it'll I think ward off some of that. And then I was also just gonna say that I have had so many like arguments with my editor about headlines, and coming from science, it's been really hard for me to swallow some of the headlines that get put on my stories. And you cringe at them, I cringe at them too. But at the end of the day, there is all the SEO stuff. But at the end of the day, like if no one clicks on our story, then why did we write it, right? So that's the game that we're playing. It's not clickbait. It's for public consumption, and people's attention is so divided. You have to give them something that feels digestible when they're sifting through a million things.
But I think a lot of us push back if it's really bad.
Yeah.
Like if we see something that's really bad, like I'll put my foot down, say absolutely not. Yeah.
Can I say one time? I had a story about an IPCC report get published with a picture of a polar bear, and I threatened to quit it unless they changed that picture because I was like, not talking about polar bears. It's not even in this document. So you can like take a stand every once in a while.
I'm a communications officer at NASA, so actually there's good reporters out there that are good communications people. I wanted to see what y'all thought about like the iterations of your stories. We're already maybe coming out the headlines is even worse, but how many of you, one of the things we do is we write our own stories, but then we'll write the social posts, we'll write a shorter version, we'll do a video version, I'll do a vertical video version. Like we'll just try to do it every possible way we can to get something to the people. Not everybody's gonna read the whole thing. What do you think of that? Do you do that with your stories? Are we wasting our time? What's your thoughts?
I've done that a lot. When the Canadian wildfires happened, CNN literally had me go out without an N95. Okay. But without an N95 and try to do a TikTok, and I had to do like a lot of different like versions of it, and we ended up just like going inside on one of the top floors because CNN's office is in New York, is in Hudson Yards, and it has a pretty good view of like the entire city, really great windows, which we should have just done in there in the first place inside, while I'm just like pointing at the orange skies. But yeah, journalism has changed. Now we have to be sort of like what I say, like a Swiss Army knife, and have to like pull out different hats and pull out different versions of ourselves. We have to do TikToks, we have to do Reels, we have to now present. Joan and I were just talking about how we need photos of ourselves and videos of ourselves because we have to brand ourselves in a different way now in Instagram, because we have, I wouldn't say competition with content creators, but like we do. And a lot of people are now consuming content creators, content of climate change that are more like opinion based and like, this is the news and this is like what we're getting from sources. So yeah, I mean, I'm not happy about the added work, but I think it's something that we have to do. I don't know,
I think TikTok should be banished from the face of the earth, but I'm not sure.
I don't know TikTok, but then I results to edits.
I am being asked to consolidate, a 3,000 word user story into a 90-second video, which kind of makes me want to stab myself in the eye, but I do it because the point is to get the information to the people, and that's where the people are, and hopefully we pique their interest and they go back, some of them go back and read the story. That's the ultimate goal. Because you don't even get, we're not monetizing Instagram, because we're journalists, we're not we don't do that. So we're not even getting anything out of people going for a social media feed or trying to drive them back to the story on our website. And then the other point that but it's like just part of the whole ecosystem of this thing now. And the other thing I just want to plant a seed in everyone's brain that will listen to me talk for 5 seconds is that there's so many news influencers who read our stories after we spent months finding out who the sources are, setting up interviews with them, doing the research, talking to people, writing the draft, editing, blah, blah, blah. They read our stories and then they do a newscast, just retelling the green screen. They put our articles as their background, but without our names or the outlet names or the link. They don't attribute anything. And then those people, and then at the end of the video, they try to sell you a supplement. That's where people are getting their information. So it's yeah, we want them to have the information, but at the end of the day, if the revenue is not coming back to where the information came from, then we can't keep doing our job. And so there's nothing that you all can do about that directly, but just tell everyone you know.
I think very, very briefly, I don't know if anyone in this room is as aware as we are that there has been a precipitous decline in traffic coming from social media to news outlets. So readership is at a bottom. I mean, we are really struggling right now to get people to read information. Sharing it on Blue Sky, sharing it on Facebook is almost worthless at this point. And so TikTok is the place where it's actually gone for the most part. And that's where we're at. So get a subscription somewhere, help buoy the system, if you can, we need readers.
Thank you for all that. One other question is, what's your advice for graduate students or early career scientists that may have a lot of the shared interests and objectives that you all have? So, you've had advice for scientists in general, and I don't know what that means to you in terms of let's say age, but for the early careers, anything specific for them about how to approach that shared interest?
For them to communicate their science or for them to go into journalism?
For them to communicate their science. If you want to convert them into journalism, that's also fine. But more, how do they work with members of the media, with journalists, how do they engage And I think, again, with likely a very shared vision of what they're trying to achieve versus what I've heard from what you'd like to achieve.
I mean, I think definitely reaching out to journalists. I think also, I think Joan mentioned the trainings in terms of like how to communicate your science. I think there's a lot of groups, and there's one here in Madison, the Open Notebook, that does these trainings that really can help people craft their message and like offer something to a journalist that is a conversation starter and can be a place where they can start to like really try to find their footing and trying to facilitate getting good coverage out there. Do you guys have other?
Yeah, I was gonna say the AAAS Media Fellowship. I know my friend Chad over there.
I did that one.
You did it too. Okay, everyone did except for me. But I've heard good things about it, and I do know that some scientists or some grad students who are on track to be scientists like had pivoted to journalists after those fellowships. But it's having that knowledge is really useful. I will also say I feel like there are some networks, and like I said in the beginning, my newsletter is being funded by the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Network, and it's the Ocean Nexus Network is a really good network as well. It's housed under the University of Rhode Island, Ocean State. And they usually host these like gatherings of ocean scientists, and they invite some journalists as well. And so like I had a couple of opportunities to spend time with them, and they would like ask me questions, a lot of questions. And I found it very fruitful. It's like a mutual kind of symbiotic relationship. Sorry.
I'm a believer in the idea that writing something is part of your critical thinking process towards understanding it. And I channeled that as when I was a grad student studying for my comprehensive exams, I started a blog on WordPress, and I didn't even tell anyone about it. I just started writing this blog about the stuff that I was learning in my own field, which was I studied native bee biodiversity patterns. And I was just trying to write something that made me feel like I had consolidated that information into some package that also looks more memorable for me. And then I shared it with my family, and they started sharing it with people, and people started reading it, and random people started commenting on it. And that's kind of how I became a journalist. But I guess the advice I would have is just like try it out. I think there's no downside to becoming a better writer, even if you just are starting doing that by writing for yourself to as a part of your thinking process, your questions and your research. Blogs aren't really so much a thing anymore, but like you can do that.
I just came a few weeks ago from the Society of Environmental Journalists Conference and went to a session about the topic of using social media to amplify your work. So I totally understand what you all are talking about. We have a similar responsibility at Q on trying to use social media to amplify what we develop for people like Sylvia and her team. There was a gentleman on the panel I was on who was, I thought, the most interesting. I don't recall his name right now. I have it in my notes somewhere. He's University of Minnesota, does a lot of work on climate science out of the Antarctic. And he has become the TikTok guy of his department. He's kind of known, and he doesn't particularly care for it, but he sees it as a necessary evil. In fact, it's been written into their job description apparently, and he is up for tenure. So he is trying to make, please follow his masters. So I've also, in my teaching responsibilities, do a lot of research and hammering my students about how the headline and the deck and the photo are so important, and the caption these days, because that's as much as anybody reads, unfortunately, in a lot of situations. And unfortunately, it's the same with social media. So hopefully, to Joan's point, we're enticing some people to go on and read that article, whether it's on one of the sites they're working for, freelancing for, or it's on the Q website. It's a tough world out there, and God only knows what AI is going to do.
Okay. Oh, thanks everyone. John, I can't cut you off. Wait, exactly. One more question.
John Hayes, Math headquarters. I was going to follow up that because I was sitting here thinking the question had been briefly mentioned earlier, but I wanted the panel's thoughts on the utilization and influence of AI on journalism and pros and cons.
Have fun, ladies.
Oh, man.
Okay. Silver line is that one of the things we know AI cannot do is break news because that information doesn't exist on the internet yet. So for the near future, to an extent, very new information that like a politician just said is not at risk of being taken over by AI. That said, those are not really the stories that any of us do. We do more like the deeply researched, talking to many scientists, analytical type of stories, and we are worried. We're trying to embrace it in turn. Like I'm trying to think about okay, what ways is AI maybe gonna help come up with climate solutions and can I help them? You know, this is such a depressing one to end on.
No, you're all on your own. But I did do one story that will come out soon in the summer issue of Audubon that is highlighting 5 different ways that AI is changing our ability to understand all of the data coming from audio recorders and camera traps in different areas in order to conserve birds. And so that was the only positive thing I have done related to AI in my reporting. But it was really interesting to try to like work through my angst over AI and come up with like what were the positives. And so I think in terms of journalism, there's not many upsides, I gotta say. But in terms of like what it can do for science and like focusing the message on that has been helpful. But last year, sometime in the last couple of years, there already was like a whole issue of a magazine, I think in Australia, that was all written by AI. And I just thought that was the death knell. Like that was what we were looking at is it's gonna get scary.
I don't have a pro, but I have friends who are journalists who work at really disinvested local newsrooms that are now fully controlled by AI editors. Like they will write a story and they're like, I'm just gonna file my story, but I'm like, they just finished telling me that they don't have editors anymore and they're just like being edited by AI, which is really freaky. And I know like BuzzFeed has started doing this as well. And also like a lot of photo editors are also now being tricked by getting tricked by like AI edited images. And so like, how do we avoid that? And things, I don't know, again, yeah, very technical.
Okay, I have a kind of pro and 2 suggestions. So I think like what Virginia said, I think it could get worse before it gets better, but I think people don't want to read something that they know was written by a robot, you know? Like, I think part of the experience of reading something is knowing that there's a writer on the other end of that someone went through a mental process and a physical, maybe on the ground reporting process to put together this information for you. It might take a little bit more of us hitting rock bottom as a society before we like find out that, I think. But I think fundamentally people don't want to just have all their input. Like, we don't really wants to live in idiocracy. We don't want that. There's going to be a revolution eventually, right? And so the suggestion is if you Google something and you read the AI summary, sometimes I do that. Well, you know, I'm like Googling things and they're related to my coverage area. And a lot of times I'll Google stuff and the AI summary will come up and it's based on the articles that I have written. So it's like summarizing the articles that I have written in an AI summary, which means that people who Google a similar thing are getting the information that I put on the internet without clicking on anything, any of the links that are where that information actually lives. So I don't know, start a movement where you click on the links and sit around a little bit. And yeah, I think we just have to push back against the robots and be human together.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that responses. Thanks to the audience for great discussion.